Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar today on building climate resilience through natural habitats, which we are happy to bring to you today on Threatened Species Day. We still have a few people trickling in, but I might get started with the introductions and we'll just see how we go. So my name is Sonia Bloom and I am a knowledge broker within the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub, and I will be facilitating today's event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am broadcasting from today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people from across Canberra and our region. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I also acknowledge their understanding and lived experience of changes in our climate and the impact to country, including their knowledge on building resilience and managing our ecosystems and environments, and the lessons we can learn from their holistic approach to managing country and the species it supports. So a big welcome to the traditional owners who have joined us here today. This is our second webinar as part of the joint webinar series between the National Environmental Science Program's Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub and Threatened Species Recovery Hub. And we're pleased to be bringing you the series on climate change, fire and biodiversity. These webinars are held every fortnight, starting with our first webinar, which was held on the 25th of August, and ending with our fourth and final webinar on the 6th of October. You can find information and register for our upcoming webinars at the link that will be dropped into the chat box shortly. So through this webinar series, we're really hoping to show the importance and the utility of bringing together both climate change and biodiversity knowledge when planning and managing our natural habitats, threatened species, and biodiverse and culturally valuable environments into the future. In today's webinar on building climate resilience through natural habitats, we'll be hearing from speakers about how our natural habitats and species are vulnerable to the changing climate, but also how natural habitats can be part of the solution to climate change, providing a range of adaptation and resilience services to protect our coasts, cities, cultural heritage and natural ecosystems. So before we get started with our first webinar, we'd really like to hear from you, our audience, right now. If you are willing to introduce yourself in the chat, please tell us who you are, your organisation and what Indigenous country you're calling in from today. You'll find the chat button at the bottom of the screen in your Zoom toolbar, and you'll just need to select all panellists and attendees to introduce yourself to everyone who's in the room. We'll be leaving this chat waterfall open for just a little while so we can get a sense of who else is in the room with us. So while you're all going about introducing yourself, I'd like to introduce our silent facilitator for today's webinar, Rachel Morgan. Rachel is the knowledge broker for the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and she'll be helping to guide us today from the chat room, letting us know what's going on and dropping links and resources throughout the webinar for you all to access. So thank you, Rachel. So I can see from the chat room that we've got quite a few people already introducing themselves. Thank you very much for that. It's lovely to see everyone from where you're from. We've got a range of people across government and universities. A big shout out to Bruce Edgerton from DEW in Agriculture in Ngunnawal Country. Also Jackie Salter from Mornington Peninsula Shire. We've got a whole range of others as well. We have David Caroli, who's the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub leader, calling in from Melbourne, and also Robert McLean in Shepparton on Yorta Yorta land. So welcome, thank you everyone. It's really lovely to have you join us today, and keep those introductions coming into the chat function while I just cover off a few more little housekeeping issues. So in addition to the chat function that you're all using now to introduce yourself, you'll also see that there's a question and answer button, a Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar. So once we've seen everyone's introductions and we've started the main part of the webinar, we'll be closing off this chat function, but we'll be keeping the question and answer function open. And by clicking on the Q&A button, you'll see that there's a panel where you can ask questions, which I will put to the panel in the second half of the webinar. You'll also see that you're able to like or upvote questions from other participants. So we do have quite a large audience here today, and I'm hopefully expecting a lot of questions coming in. So we probably won't, well, most likely won't be able to answer every single question that comes in. So by upvoting a question that you find particularly of importance or of interest to you, it just shows us which are the more popular questions, and then we'll try to prioritise those questions in the panel session coming up. Just another note as well, that we will be sending around a resource pack after the webinar. So this will include some answers to key questions that we haven't been able to answer in the panel session live today. It'll also include relevant links to resources and also the slides from each of our presentations here today. So please note also that we are recording this webinar and it will be available for viewing through YouTube at a later date. So in a moment, we'll be closing off the chat. Thank you so much again to everyone for introducing yourself from across the country, and a couple that I can see internationally as well. This is really fantastic. And please remember that once we get started into the speakers, to switch over to the Q&A function and pop your questions into that function at any time throughout the webinar. So I think we'll hand over now to our first speaker. I'd like to introduce John Clark. John is a research team leader at CSIRO and leads the outreach component of the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub Regional Climate Change Projections Project. John has a decade of experience developing and delivering climate projections tailored to the needs of practitioners and researchers in the climate impact and adaptation fields. So John, I'll hand over to you now to begin your presentation.
Thanks, Sonia. Hopefully you can see this shortly. How's that? Great. All right. Thanks again, Sonia, and welcome everybody. I'm going to dive straight in. We've only got short time, so I'm going to dive straight into talking to you a little bit about the ways in which climatic extremes are expected to change as we go forward into the 21st century, and then look at an example of where climate projections data sets have been used to better inform management of a vulnerable species, the greater glider in Victoria. So straight into climate extremes. Firstly, we can think of climatic extremes as changing in two ways: through shifts in the mean state of the climate and through changes to climate processes. And I'll just touch briefly on both of those processes. So this is a plot of all of the results from all the available climate models running from about 1910 through to about 2090. And on the left-hand side in grey, you can see a wide band, and that's the climate models versions of the 20th century. And in these bands on the right-hand side in colour, they're the climate models versions of the future climate. And this brown line that's going up and down is the actual climate, the annual average temperatures in this case, compared to a reference period in the past. So this is called an anomaly plot. The point of showing you this is that it's important that you understand that even though the temperature of the climate is projected to go up in a line like these, depending which emissions pathway we follow, this up and down that's happened in the past is the natural variability signal, and we expect that to continue into the future. Now, this is one of the ways, this is the first way in which extremes are impacted by the shifting base climate. If we think about this point here, this was the hottest year on record in 2013. That was 23 degrees average temperature across Australia for the year. 2013, hottest year on record at that time. If we carry that temperature through into the future, by the time we get to 2040, that will be one of the coolest years that's occurring due to natural variability. So you can see that this hottest year on record is going to be getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter as we go forward into the future, depending, of course, which emissions pathway we follow. So that's the first way. The second way is through changes in the way in which the climate system operates. So synoptic changes can do things like cause a heat wave to travel more slowly across the landscape and make the heat wave longer. But we also know that the warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, and this means that when it does rain, it's likely to rain in much heavier downpours. And we also know that when there's a declining rainfall, like is projected for much of southern Australia, the reduced cloud that's in the sky increases the outbound and inbound radiation, and that can increase frost risk and also lead to hotter extremes. So to give you an example, this is from some work that we did back in 2015 for Australia, and these bar plots on the left show the annual projected change in rainfall for 2 emission scenarios. The highest emission scenario is in that pinky color and the lower one in the blue color. The next bunch of bars shows the wettest day of the year, and the one on the right shows the wettest day in 20 years. And so you can see that in this plot, even though the annual average rainfall is expected to go down in most model simulations, in almost all simulations it's expected to go up for the wettest day of the year and the wettest day in 20 years. So another way of saying that is that rainfall intensity is expected to increase even under circumstances where the total rainfall is expected to go down on average. And you can see that this is the case for Eastern Australia, Southern Australia, as well as the rangelands. In the wet tropics region in Northern Australia, it's more difficult to project what's happening with the annual average rainfall, but you can see that the extreme rainfall events are still increasing irrespective of what's happening with average rainfall. And the plot on the right, I've included just to show you that when we run even high resolution climate model simulations, we occasionally simulate some really extreme events. This is a day in the 2090s from one climate model simulation run at 5 kilometre resolution, so quite high resolution for climate modelling. And you can see from the shading here that much of Victoria is up around the 50-degree mark. So fairly serious extreme changes simulated by the climate models. And then, of course, we can take the climate information and we can build secondary data sets from those. And in this case, we've done this with fire danger. This is work that was done by the NESP hub, led by Andrew Dowdy from the Bureau of Meteorology, where they reanalyzed the past fire climate for all of Australia and confirmed what most of us have already known. Fire weather has become more dangerous since the mid-1900s. The fire seasons have become longer and are starting earlier. And these trends, when we look at the projection side of things, these trends are expected to continue. And here's just one example from some work we did for Victoria recently. In Bairnsdale, if we think about the number of days where the forest fire danger index is greater than the historic 95th percentile, so that means 5 out of 100 days basically occur above this particular threshold. They're likely to increase by a median of 5.8 days per year by mid-century under the high emissions pathway. That's a 32% increase. And that's fairly typical. Some places have smaller increases than that. Some places have significantly larger increases. I think Shepparton goes up by 60% or something. So the extremes are reflected also in these other variables from which that we calculate from climate data. So now moving on to an example of the use of climate projections data sets for threatened species management. In this case, we're talking about the greater glider species that's listed as vulnerable in Victoria and pretty much everywhere else that it occurs as well. It occurs from Queensland down into Victoria. So the Casey Vicinton and Natalie Briscoe and others from Melbourne Uni wanted to do some future population modelling for greater gliders, taking into account future climate data. And they were taking an approach that linked biophysical models with landscape models and population dynamics models. And they needed quite detailed future climate data sets. So I worked with them to identify what they would regard as the worst case and the best case for greater gliders in future based on the changes in the average temperatures that are projected. And using the climate futures approach that CSIRO have developed, identified 3 representative climate models for each of those three cases listed there: best case, worst case, and maximum consensus case. So the best case, i.e., has the least impact on greater gliders, represented by this particular model here. The worst case, hottest and driest future climate, represented by this one here. And the maximum consensus, which is simply the future climate that is simulated by the greatest number of models out of the collection that's available, 40-odd models, is represented by this MEROC 5 model. Don't really need to worry about the names because they're pretty hard to understand. Just think about the cases. And we looked at data for 2 emissions pathways, the highest emissions pathway and a low intermediate one. And we looked at initially the 2030s and then expanded the work out into the 2050s and 2070s. And on the right, I've just given you a snapshot of 2 variables from this HADGEM2 CC model. So that's the worst case model. This is maximum temperature at a 5-kilometre grid for their study area on the Central Highlands in Victoria. And this one underneath it is rainfall. Same resolution, same model, just showing you some examples of the data. So how did they use those data? Well, they took, basically, these data are a daily time series. So essentially they look like ordinary weather data. So this means that they can be plugged into the sorts of models that Casey and Natalie were using. So the future climate data, climate projections, were the primary inputs to the microclimate and greater glider biophysical models used to determine survival and reproductive potential over the next 50 years. And they're being used to determine climate extremes as input variables to greater glider habitat modelling, suitability modelling across the same region. And they can look at the extremes because these data, because they're daily, and they basically, it's a time series that steps forward one day at a time. You can pull out information on the hottest day of the month, hottest day of the year, hottest day of the decade, things like that, and likewise for other variables. And in work that hasn't been completed yet, they're also going to use these projections data in the Landis model to determine forest change across the Central Highlands. All of this is still a work in progress, but they have all of the data that they need to complete this work now. And that's where I'll stop. Thanks, Sonia.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that presentation and for the brief overview you gave of extremes and the example of how we can use climate change data to inform biodiversity management and planning. So that was really great. Our next speaker today is Nikki Mitchell from the University of Western Australia and the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. Nikki leads research on predicting impacts of climate change on threatened species and on intervention strategies such as assisted colonisation. She has particular expertise on how global warming will affect sex determination and survival in reptiles, especially sea turtles. So Nikki, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. Yep, okay. So hi everyone, I'm speaking here from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people in West Australia, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So on Australia's Threatened Species Day, I'm actually going to focus on one of the world's most endangered reptiles, which is this species you can see on screen, the Western swamp turtle, and tell you about a more than 10-year project we've been running trying to help this species or give it some options for persisting in the very rapid drying climate that we see in the southwest of Australia. But just a bit of background and context on extreme events that John's been sort of alluding to. We certainly, in the media, you see a lot of reporting of the impacts of extreme events. They're causing mass mortalities in a lot of our flying foxes, bird die-offs. And of course, we're only seeing these impacts in some areas where humans occur. There's a lot of these sorts of events happening in areas where people are not able to see their impacts. Also, sea turtles, which is one of the things I work on, things like increasing storm frequencies or eroding beaches, which are the rookeries for a lot of our populations. So in terms of what we can do about mitigating impacts of extreme events, there are practical solutions in terms of habitat engineering, which I'm not going to talk about because actually what my work is more about is looking at the sort of impacts of systemic change in our climate, more about the gradual shifts that we're seeing from moving from cooler to warmer states or from wetter to drier states in the case of the southwest of Australia. So some biologists have termed these two sort of threatening processes, the press stressor and the pulse stressor. So I think of pulses as extreme events and press being that general background threat of the change in the climate. So what my group tends to do, we focus on threatened vertebrates, in particular the ectotherms, the cold-blooded species. So I'm an expert on reptiles and amphibians. So some of the fundamental things we're doing are just literally working out the physiological thresholds of species, because you might not be aware how little we know actually about what the physical tolerances in terms of temperature and water stress our species can take. So sea turtles famously, their sex is determined at certain temperatures, so we do a lot of work working out those thresholds, their survival thresholds. In terms of amphibians, I work on terrestrial breeding species. So these species have eggs in the soil, and as those soils are drying out, those phenotypes, or those basically the fitness of the offspring are eroded by drier climates, and even things like the calling potential of frog populations diminishes as they get dehydrated. So we've been doing some projects about whether or not we can use a tool called assisted gene flow or targeted gene flow, because a lot of populations do have more resilient populations. So a lot of species, will have more resilient populations in parts of their range, areas that might be laterally drier and warmer. Maybe we can use genotypes from those populations and mix them in with more core habitats where the stress is sort of emerging. And so that's one of the things we've been doing with this model frog. It's a species related to the corroboree frog, which I'm sure you've heard of as a highly threatened species. This is a non-threatened species, but actually we're starting to see that climate change is really having an impact on this species, which is in a fragmented landscape. And so we've been testing mixing populations and found that we can do some quite positive results when drier populations are mixed with wetter populations. But it doesn't work across the board. You really need to do these experiments in the lab to sort of be sure what outcomes you might get. But it's a great option to have for species that are external fertilizing, like fish and amphibians. They're quite easy to do mixing genes by simply doing fertilization experiments, which could even be done in the field. But what I'm going to talk about is actually the main project, which is assisting species to relocate into areas that are going to be more suitable for them as the climate changes. So this is an idea which was sort of popularized in around the 1980s with the term assisted colonization. It's now formally defined by the IUCN as a type of translocation, but the distinctive thing about assisted colonization is it's moving species outside areas where they've ever been known to occur, and they're conservation introductions to avoid a threatening process. So in the literature that appeared around 2008, a lot of people thought this was something we should be thinking about doing to cope with climate change. A lot of species are going to be isolated in fragments and they cannot relocate because the connecting habitat is gone. But there's also a lot of discomfort about this idea from invasion biologists in particular, who've certainly seen the impacts of when species have been moved out of range. Things don't always go according to plan, as the cartoon alludes to. But actually in Australia and New Zealand, we've been doing assisted colonisation for about a century. More than 50 species have been moved outside their indigenous range. And the reason has been not climate change, but because of the concern that threat-introduced predators were going to cause extinctions. And that certainly would have been the case for many species. And they've only been saved by assisted colonisation, often to offshore islands. But we haven't really been starting to sort of move yet on moving species outside of their ranges to avoid or mitigate the threat of climate change, except perhaps there's one species, the western swamp turtle, which we did a trial back in 2016, which was a world first attempt to trial movement outside of the indigenous range in response to the drying climate. So this species, on Threatened Species Day, it's one of the Australia's rarest reptiles. Only about 50 or so animals persist in this tiny patch of habitat. It was actually thought to be extinct until the 1950s, but then was rediscovered just on the edge of Perth. And by that time, a lot of its connecting habitat had vanished thanks to agricultural development. So this is a movie. We're just zooming over Ellenbrook Nature Reserve right now, and you can see the Great Northern Highway here. There's light industry, there's hobby farmers, there's increasingly the suburban areas of Perth are encroaching this species' last core habitat. It's surrounded by a fence to keep out foxes and cats, but it's only really big enough for about maybe 70 adult animals. These things live for about 100, maybe 70 to 80 years, we're not really sure. And really climate change is a major problem for this species. So they live in these seasonal wetlands that have to dry every summer, otherwise the species won't reproduce. But what's been happening when the species was rediscovered in the 60s, the hydro periods, which is the period when swamps hold water, were about 7 to 8 months long. And now, and that's when the turtles are active, that's when they are entering the water, that's when they're finding their food and mating, and females are hopefully getting enough food that in that wet period to produce energy for reproduction and dropping eggs clutches. But what's happened in extreme events, we've had a lot of very extreme years recently, particularly in the last decade, where winter rainfall has been really quite reduced. The hydro periods have been down to 3 or 4 months, and that really constrains how much energy the female can acquire for reproduction. And if you've just hatched and this is your first period in the water, you've got a very short time to grow, and that means you're quite small when the water dries out, and that means you're more vulnerable to extreme heat wave events. So this is one of the reasons we really looked for a solution for this species in terms of assisted colonisation. We had to move it beyond its indigenous range, partly because the indigenous range is very small, but also recognising that the natural habitat is changing quickly and becoming much drier. So we used we're calling this our Goldilocks conundrum, trying to find the place that's just right for the Western swamp turtle. And we've used the same kind of model that John just alluded to called Niche Mapper, which has been championed by Michael Carney at Melbourne Uni. He's one of our collaborators. Niche Mapper can predict the microclimates for your species. So if you're interested in below the ground temperatures and moisture, above ground, Niche Mapper can solve that using climate surfaces for any particular location. We've also worked with wetland ecologists who can build more detailed and accurate simulations of the hydro periods of our species. And then we can interface that with physical data on our species and physiological data, such as its physical tolerances, its metabolic rates. And to do that, we can put all this together in this modelling framework to predict the fundamental niche that's theoretically where the species could occur, where the abiotic environment is just right. And you can the beauty of this sort of modelling is you can run it with any climate surface, including future climate projections, and you can see how robust the habitat suitability will be under a different range of climates. So we did this back in 2013, and we looked at about shortly ahead, we looked at 2030 simulations. And we showed that they were looking pretty good to be able to persist quite well on the southwest coast of West Australia. And then, of course, we've got a screening model, but then we actually had to add reality, because it doesn't mean that there's a wetland in every location that looks suitable. In many cases, these wetlands have been cleared, but we've also used expert elicitation and a whole range of GIS tools to basically narrow it down to some candidate sites. So in 2016, we began this project with a trial assisted colonisation. We worked with the Perth Zoo, major partner here, because they produce the animals for release. So they produce about 50 juvenile turtles every year for translocation programs. So in 2016, we tried moving them to the north, which is a current site, and we tried 2 new sites right down on the south coast. And again, this got a bit of media attention because it really was a fairly novel initiative. And this is Alex Boomer, one of my master's students. So she was charged with monitoring what happened in this trial. So turtles were relocated every fortnight and then weighed and measured, and we were able to look at their growth through this short trial, which was only about 6 months long. So here you can see in the northern side at Moore River, they grew quite rapidly and then stopped growing because the water runs out. But they were able to keep growing, even though they took a bit longer to get going in the south, and grew to an equivalent size, even though they were about 350 kilometres south in a colder climate. So that was pretty encouraging, but you can see here one site we didn't get very good results. So we went again in 2018 with a second trial. This time though, we were much more focused on trying to understand the consequences of turtles being put into colder climates, even if the water lasts longer, because it might mean that they're actually spending a bit more time in the day trying to warm up to be able to eat. And so this was data collected by Siobhan Paget from these tags that we glued onto the back called data storage tags. To cut to the chase, we've shown quite clearly using these tags that the behaviour is quite different depending on where the turtles are released. And they are having to spend more time in these southern climates basking, which might actually compromise their ability to forage to some extent. This is just some results of the 2 trials put together, and the main take-home message is that at that Mirror-Up site, which we tried twice, neither time did it work. We didn't get good enough growth in order to meet the criteria of our translocation plan. So we've actually abandoned the trial down at one of these sites. But we're quite confident that East Augusta, which is the site in 2016 that they grew well, is going to be really quite a promising site to introduce this species. So right now we're doing work with a new PhD student who's shown here, Bethany. She's looking at really trying to understand much better the food sources for this species, looking for threatened species using methods like DNA metabarcoding, and also trying to develop eDNA methodologies to detect the turtles, because they become very difficult to monitor once you start releasing them into these sort of unfenced landscapes. So basically what we're hoping is next year we'll be ready to trial a quite big release in a new site at East Augusta. And hopefully if that works, we'll be able to establish a sort of climate-proof, robust population of this species to give it some security in addition to its natural habitat at Ellenbrook. So if assisted colonisation, I think, is going to be increasingly of interest to conservation managers, and there are a lot of decision support tools out there now. Those climate products that John alluded to are essential for generating models to look at habitat suitability. Though these projects are more challenging and complex, partly because of the stakeholder engagement. If you're introducing species into new habitats, there might be the need to restore habitats. There might be the need to initiate captive breeding. And of course, risk assessments are a really important part of it. But really, it's really by doing trials like this, I think, and building it into your adaptive management framework, that we can really make some leaps forward in understanding whether these sorts of interventions might give us a solution for some of our most threatened species. So thanks very much. I'll hopefully see you later.
Great, thank you, Nikki. It's actually quite fascinating to hear of some of the intervention strategy trials that you're undertaking and some of the challenges and successes that you're experiencing. So thanks for that. Our next speaker is Rebecca Morris. Becky leads research in the ecological engineering theme within the National Centre for Coasts and Climate, which is supported by the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub. Becky's work is focused on nature-based coastal defence. She works in interdisciplinary teams of marine ecologists, engineers and social scientists to investigate the role natural and created coastal habitats have in managing erosion and flooding. So over to you, Becky. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. Oops. So we heard earlier from John about the increase in frequency or magnitude of climate extremes. And on the coast, this presents a challenge by increasing the exposure of a growing coastal population to existing and future hazards like flooding and erosion. Traditionally, the answer to protecting people against hazards has been hard engineered structures. And commonly in Australia, these have included seawalls or rock revetment. Continued widespread use of these structures into the future poses a number of problems. And the first one being that if we continue to blanket use hard structures, that this is not economically viable because they're expensive to construct and also to maintain. And part of this expense comes from the fact that these structures are static. They're non-adaptive. They need to be upgraded or rebuilt in response to a changing climate, or repaired if they're damaged by a storm, for example. They also have significant environmental and social consequences, as our natural shorelines are replaced with artificial ones. And this results in a loss of biodiversity and an increase in non-native species. And from a social perspective, can result in things like a disconnect from nature or a loss of beach amenity. So due to this increased demand for risk reduction measures under future climate and coastal population scenarios, but also due to the fact that many structures around Australia are also reaching their current design life, it is very timely to consider whether there are other solutions for risk reduction into the future that are more economically, environmentally, or socially sustainable. And so some of these other options involves a field of science called ecological engineering. And this approach involves a spectrum of methods that ranges from hard to hybrid to soft. And so I'm very happy for you to ask me any questions about hard eco-engineering, but for now I'm going to be talking about hybrid and soft methods because of the time today and also our focus on coastal resilience. So I will look briefly at what are nature-based methods, when and why we might use them, finishing off with a couple of examples. So nature-based coastal defence are habitat-forming organisms that includes dunes, coastal vegetation, biogenic reefs that are restored or created to provide a natural coastal defence service. And they're able to do this by attenuating waves as they approach the shore, accumulating, increase the elevation of the land relative to the sea level, and they can also stabilise the shoreline. In terms of them being adaptive, this increasing elevation or vertical growth that happens with things like oyster reefs has been shown to be able to occur at a rate that matches sea level rise. And often their cost benefits can far exceed the coastal protection aspect alone, as they provide a number of co-benefits like water filtration or carbon sequestration, making them a tool to mitigate climate change as well. So there is growing evidence that nature-based methods are effective and resilient. So this particular example is a method that's widely used in Chesapeake Bay in the United States, and it's a rock sill with gaps that allow tidal inundation of salt marsh behind it. So this living shoreline can reduce wave heights by over 70%. And then there was another study by Gitman that showed in response to a hurricane, these structures suffered much less damage than bulkheads, and that the salt marsh was able to self-repair within a year. And this is in contrast to the bulkheads that you can see a picture of in this slide as well, that when these get damaged, they will need to be repaired or replaced at a significant cost. So nature-based methods are only effective when they're used in the right environment though. And so the risk level and the environmental context should really inform the technical selection of the intervention. So I'm not going to go into this into too much detail, but you will see a link to a paper that we wrote turn up into the chat if you would like to read more. But there are a few considerations in terms of nature-based coastal defense. And so the first one is time. And this falls under the risk or urgency of protection on the x-axis of this diagram. The nature-based methods are a forward-thinking intervention. They require time to establish and be effective. Where coastal management decisions are made reactively or taking a fix-on-failure approach, where the decision is only made once something becomes high risk, then often hard defenses become the only option. There are certain hybrid approaches that can eliminate some of the time sensitivity of nature-based methods, and I'll provide some examples of these later. But in particular, if you're using a soft solution, which is in the bottom left of this two axes, you really need time for the habitat to grow. And this is in contrast to hard structures that can often be constructed on shorter timeframes. However, even some much larger infrastructure projects can be years in the making. In terms of the environmental context on the y-axis, the type of nature-based method will depend on the suitability of the environment to support that habitat and the hazard you wish to protect against. And these two are actually linked as well. Generally, those soft defenses can be more suited to lower energy environments, or those that have remnant habitat left that can be rehabilitated. And this is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's because soft defenses can take longer to recover when they are exposed to high hazards, and this depends on the frequency of events as well as recruitment potential and sediment supply. But also where you have lost a habitat in the past, which has resulted in higher hydrodynamic energy, it can be harder to restore these habitats because the feedback mechanisms that protect young recruits aren't there. Hybrid approaches can overcome some of these limitations as the green and grey components work together. And a really good example of a hybrid approach in Australia is estuary bank stabilisation with rock fillets that's been used for the past 20 years in New South Wales. So the rock provides immediate tow protection for the bank, and it also stabilises the sediment. And this allows for the recruitment of mangroves through the gap at one end of the fillet. So you'll see these sites are not recruitment limited. In this middle photo here, you can see all of these seedlings that have popped up. But without the rock, the erosion rate is too high for the mangroves to establish, and they become eroded out. And so the mangroves don't last past 1 year. We did some research over 4 estuaries in New South Wales that have used these rock fillets, and we saw that over time the sediment accumulates within the fillet and the estuary bank then naturally reprofiles. And also the structure of mangroves becomes very similar to those that naturally fringe the shoreline. One of the key to having a sustainable rock fillet is having the space to put it in initially, but also to have the space for these structures to widen over time. And you can see many of these have been put adjacent to agricultural land. A second example is a shellfish reef breakwater on the Bellarine Peninsula in Port Phillip Bay. So this was in response to persistent erosion and flooding of the foreshore properties that you can see in this photo. And this was put in by City of Greater Geelong, supported by the Victorian government. And so in this project, instead of using the commonly used concrete breakwater units or large rock, this structure uses smaller rock and recycled shell substrate, which is contained within steel cages. that have then been seeded with blue mussels obtained from the local aquaculture industry. And so the idea is that this reef will take advantage of the natural cementation of the mussels over time to provide a sustained living reef. So in the short term, over the first 18 months, this has resulted in the accumulation of over 1,000 cubic meters of sand. The mussels are surviving well, and there's even been small berms on the beach, which has been further stabilized with dune vegetation. Staying along the example of dunes for our final example. So dunes are a common feature on the open coast, and so these make for a good ecosystem to work within that environment. But during erosion events, they can suffer steep erosion scarps. So this final example is one by my colleague, Theresa Conlechner. And at this particular location, the problem of these erosion scarps was an ecological one, in that the little penguins could not access their nesting sites. So this is down at the Penguin Parade. So in collaboration with Phillip Island Nature Parks, dune notches were created by an excavator as an alternative to tow protection of this dune using a revetment, which you can see in this picture. Some areas of the shoreline have already been revetted in this way. And these notches are self-sustaining, and they give penguins access to the dune habitat. So this is a really nice example to finish off of nature-based methods protecting an environmental value, not just the infrastructure values that we've seen in the previous example. So for my last slide, I just want to finish off to highlight an upcoming resource that will be available at the end of the year to provide some guidance around the use and different methods for nature-based coastal defense. And if you have any questions about that or anything in the rest of the presentation, then I'm happy for you to contact me. We finished.
Great, thanks Becky. Some really great images there on a range of different hybrid and natural coastal protection options that are available to us to build climate resilience in our coastal environments. So thanks for that. Moving on to our next speaker, which is Georgia Garand. Georgia is an interdisciplinary conservation scientist in ICON Science and Sustainability and Urban Planning at RMIT University, and is a Threatened Species Recovery Hub lead researcher. Her research seeks to improve biodiversity outcomes in human-dominated landscapes through better planning, design and communication. So over to you, Georgia.
Thanks, Sonia. Just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today. As Sonia mentioned, I'm Georgia Garrard. I'm at RMIT University, and though I've been associated with the NESP Threatened Species Recovery Hub for many years, I'm not going to be talking about NESP-funded research today. And in fact, I'm not really going to be talking about my own research at all. And rather, I'm going to talk about how this issue of building resilience is playing out in cities. And challenges for native habitats and biodiversity more generally. So in Australia and around the world, changing climates are presenting enormous challenges for urban planners and administrators. In particular, people are concerned about maintaining livability in cities as they warm, but they're also really focused on protecting lives and infrastructure from extreme events such as fire and flooding. In response to these challenges, cities are embracing nature-based solutions, and it's really nice that Becky was able to introduce the concept of nature-based solutions in the previous talk. Both Melbourne and Sydney, for example, have urban forest strategies that include targets to increase tree canopy cover in the cities, primarily to help reduce the impact of warming. But cities are looking to use nature-based solutions to address a whole range of other challenges as well, including carbon storage, flood mitigation, and water and air purification. And as an example, I guess, of the momentum behind nature-based solutions, these are two enormous projects, Urban Greenup and Naturevation, which are funded by the European Union to identify, implement, and mainstream nature-based solutions in cities all around the world. So this focus on nature-based solutions in cities presents, I think, an enormous opportunity for the conservation of natural habitats and native species. But it is theoretically possible to increase the canopy cover and reduce the temperature of cities by planting the same tree in every street. So how do we ensure that biodiversity also gets a look in this rush to climate-proof our cities? Well, I think the answer lies in seeking nature-based solutions that address multiple challenges in cities and in understanding how natural habitats and native species can enhance the impact of these nature-based solutions. So, for example, there's growing pressure to create cities that enhance human health and well-being, and we know that native biodiversity is really important for doing this. So on the left, we can see a recent study from South Australia that found that having a diverse array of native plants in urban green spaces was important for helping to strengthen people's immune systems. And similarly, researchers from the UK showed many years ago that the restorative capacity of green spaces to address mental fatigue was improved when the vegetation was diverse. And on a similar vein, most cities also have objectives to provide access to nature experience to their residents. And so recent COVID restrictions really, I think, highlighted how important access to nature is for urban residents, with engagement, for example, in BirdLife Australia's Birds in Backyards surveys increasing tenfold under lockdown. But they've also brought into stark focus the inequitable access to nature across city suburbs. And so there's an example here of an article which revealed that around 340,000 Melburnians had little or no access to parkland, which within 5 kilometres of their home, which was the furthest distance people were able to travel in order to exercise under the really severe lockdowns that we've experienced in Victoria recently. So enhancing the nature in nature-based solutions throughout cities presents, I think, a real opportunity to help ensure equitable access to everyday nature experiences for all urban residents. Many Australian cities are also keen to make a positive contribution to biodiversity. So we know that Australian cities are hotspots for biodiversity, and that in fact, the fate of at least 39 threatened and endangered species will depend on conservation within cities, because that's the only place where they now exist. And you can see there the Western swamp tortoise is listed as one of those species. So there's real value in seeking nature-based solutions that can also improve conservation outcomes for threatened urban species in cities. So by incorporating diversity, both the resilience and benefits offered by nature-based solutions can be enhanced, and the potential to realise biodiversity benefits is also increased. So this, I think, is the first, I guess, of the real huge opportunities, that the momentum and will to embrace nature-based solutions to help build resilience to climate change presents this extraordinary opportunity to recognise the value of natural habitats, but also to enhance them. But I guess one of the key points here is that it's not just going to happen on its own. We need to plan to seize this opportunity, and we need to do it quite urgently, or risk this opportunity passing us by. But on the flip side, I guess seeking resilience to climate change in cities might also inadvertently threaten natural habitats. And the increased threat of wildfire, for example, is an area where policy and practice could quite easily lead to the loss of natural habitats in cities. And so here the image on the left shows an area of Upwey in the Dandenong Ranges, which are, exist in the east of Melbourne. They're a really high fire-prone area. So under current restrictions, which allow people in bushfire zones to clear vegetation that's close to buildings, almost all of the vegetation in this image could be cleared without a permit. So all of the vegetation in the right-hand side image that is shaded in red is vegetation that can be cleared without a permit under our existing bushfire regulations. So here there's a direct conflict, I guess, between the role of vegetation for increasing resilience, but also the perceived or actual threat that it poses to urban residents. Similarly, new developments in growth areas must put in place a pretty substantial buffer between the built environment and native vegetation in order to protect residents from fire. And typically this comes in the form of a road or some other impervious surface. So protecting people from fire risk is clearly very important, and it's important both for saving lives and infrastructure, but also for minimising the potential for acrimonious attitudes towards natural habitats. But by separating the built and natural environments in this way, current approaches really don't do anything to create opportunities for nature experiences for urban residents. And I think, you know, perhaps even more concerning, there's the potential for it to reinforce feelings amongst residents that natural habitats are bad and dangerous, which is exactly the opposite of what government policy is really striving for. So I think there's an opportunity that's quite exciting to investigate whether nature-based solutions can be used to address this current conflict. Although I need to put a caveat here and say that this is definitely an area where more research is required to inform a solid evidence base. But here in this image, for example, the city of Greater Bendigo has used ironbarks to suppress the growth of spiny rush and pampas grass in the understory, which posed an unacceptable fire risk in this urban green space. The trees have reduced the fuel load in the understory, and they've also provided some habitat for biodiversity. There's also some emerging evidence to suggest that species composition plays a huge role in determining fire severity. And I think it would be really fruitful to investigate whether less flammable native or exotic species can be used to slow or suppress fire at a landscape scale in urban fringe environments. And then finally, what if instead of a hard black road, which contributes to the urban heat island, we use no grass lawns as a fire break and buffer between native vegetation and new suburbs? Could these places use low growing, flowering indigenous plant species to create a fire buffer that is both effective and beautiful, while also helping to connect residents with the natural habitats in which they live? I, for one, would like to find out if these are options to use our natural habitats to further increase the resilience of urban environments to climate change. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks Georgia. Great to hear those thoughts on the benefits of nature-based solutions for biodiversity resilience in urban areas. Really fascinating. So moving on to our last speaker for today, which is Samala Deshong, who is a descendant from the Koin-Mirraburra and Kabi tribes in Queensland. Samala works on Koin-Mirraburra, which is her mother's country, on the coast of central Queensland. She works in natural resource management as an Indigenous project officer and is a member on 2 traditional owner working groups of the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, as well as a member of the steering committee for the First Nations people gathering on climate change, which is supported by the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub. So I'll now pass over to you, Samala, for your presentation. Thanks. So you're just on mute, Samala.
Yep, sorry. Hi, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Yuwabara people whose country that I'm presenting on today. Thanks for the introduction, Sonia. Today I'm going to speak to you about our partnership approach to reporting Indigenous cultural heritage values and conditions in the Mackay, Whitsunday and Isaac region. Next slide. Oh, okay, next slide, sorry. Oh, that's it, yeah. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the report card today. We have the Healthy Rivers to Reef partnership in the Mackay region. It is actually taken from Gladstone Ports, where they started scoring and producing a report card. This is something that the Mackay, Whitsunday, Isaac region took on board, and there's one clear objective for it, is just to produce a regional annual waterways healthy report card. It started in 2014. I was actually involved from 2015, and our main thing is to put the cultural heritage scorecard in the assessment, or do the assessments for the scorecard. And we've produced 2. We've been involved in 2, so it's biennial, every 2 years at the traditional owners report. Next, thanks. Okay, so I guess this slide pretty much well says it all. Why a report card? It's a great communications piece within the region, and it's a tool to report, a lot of more complex information. And I guess it's a lot easier with the scores for people that don't have a lot of knowledge or don't work in that area of environment or the waterways to understand, you know, what's happening in the waterways in the region and how they're being assessed. It's been a great opportunity for the traditional owners and, you know, to create, I guess, partnerships and collaborate with the lights, you know, with the Whitsunday mob, with the tourism and the councils and state government too. So it has allowed for us to, you know, meet a lot of, you know, agricultural farmers and everything and just start some discussions and, you know, try and create partnerships and network. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, so yeah, in 2015, I was invited to represent the traditional owners in Mackay, Whitsunday, Isaac region on the Healthy Rivers to Reef panel and partnership. My main aim was to represent the traditional owners. And I guess I attended a few meetings, and one of the things that the biggest problems was that there was no cultural heritage included in the first report cards. It was talked about, but it was something that, you know, we didn't know how to do. So the biggest question was, why were we involved, and how could we, the traditional owners, add value to the report card within the region? One of the obstacles too was that, you know, stakeholders' perspective on environmental values is different from us First Nations people. Yeah, so that started the process of having discussions on including cultural heritage. It's very rich in our region. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so we have in Mackay Whitsunday region, through reef catchments, we have a traditional owner reference group. I've actually been on the reference group since it started, one of the founding members, 15 years now. Our purpose is to be a part of natural environment, or natural resources and environment, and I guess just be recognised, have inclusion in, you know, have a voice in being a part of looking after country. So the purpose of our group was to assess the values and conditions of the significant sites, especially associated around the waterways, and just to track changes over the time and to inform management. One of the biggest issues for the traditional owners in the region is that we're not included in a lot of the work. I guess I wouldn't call it segregation, but we're separated. We get funding, we do projects. A lot of organisations get funding, they do the same projects, different outcomes. And I guess it was sort of, you know, it was pretty much, well, we didn't work together. And I guess it's about creating them partnerships and trying to work together and share knowledge. And share resources for the future of the waterways and that. Okay, next slide. I think, yep. Okay, so like I said, in this region, we have a lot of islands. A lot of us members on the talk are coastal or sea people. So we do have a lot of sites that we still go and assess and maintain. So, you know, site types are like shell middens, rock shelters, engravings. We have a lot of them at Whitsunday Islands, that mob, rock art and that. Yeah. So in the region, like a lot of our sites are close together. So we had to decide, I guess we didn't call them sites, we had to assess them as areas. Now, a lot of these are on the coastline and are affected by, you know, the changing climate, weather events, all that, etc. Next slide. Yeah, we do have an abundance of fish traps. The traditional owner reference group is represented by 7 tribes, and we span from Bowen in the north all the way to, I guess, Coimba country. It's between Mackay and Rockhampton, mainly Clairview, out to, out west. Sorry, I forget. But yeah, so we do have an abundance of fish traps. In 2009, I think it was, we did do a project with Dr. Bryce Barker on fish traps. We found that there were essentially about 30 or more within the Mackay Whitsunday region. Okay, so the assessment area, sorry. So, you know, being on the coastline, we have, you know, we do have extensive cyclones, especially in my country. We have high, really fast flowing currents, very high tides. So loss of sites is significant. You know, there's a majority of them gone. So, you know, that could be from desecration of sites too, development, agriculture. So, like I said before, we had to pick out of all of these sites. I think we started with about 40 or 50, and we had to wean them down to, I think, the 4 zones to put in the to do the assessments on for the report cards. Yep, next slide. Okay, the report card. So, as I said, it was really hard to try and figure out how we could, you know, have a scorecard on the assessments, because we look at things, our knowledge system is pretty much, well, a very holistic approach we have. Like, it's not just about water, you know, it's about the trees, the animals, people, etc. So we enlisted an archaeologist to help co-design a methodology, I guess you'd say, as to how to include cultural heritage values in the assessment. So it was pretty hard because we're grounded by our knowledge systems, and the activities are challenging because there was a lot of jargon, rich language that we had to dissect to understand, to be able to work out some indicators and measures that would be suitable to score on. Yep, so as you can see, you know, our holistic approach, I guess we broke them, I don't know, we had so many indicators, I can't even remember the amount. So, you know, we broke them into spiritual and social value, archaeological, physical condition, and what came, like it says there, you know, the impacts and threats. Most of it was environment, inundation, erosion, things like that, humans and animals, your protection of sites, and just the cultural maintenance, just the management arrangements of what we had decided to do each time to do the assessments. Next slide, please. Oh, no, not that one. Can you go there? Oh, sorry, I've thrown that in the wrong one. So Naro Inlet, the Naro people, they're the Whitsundays, the island snob. You know, we went out and we assessed their sites a lot. They have a lot of rock art on the islands. Climate change has played a big part in us choosing a lot of the sites where we're seeing a lot of changes. So it took about 2 or 3 months to choose the sites because, as I said, what we have left, you know, they're all a priority to us. Some were managed, some were under a management but weren't managed, and some weren't managed at all. So the inclusion of adaptation was a major part in us picking these assessment sites too. For our future planning is the key to the continuity of our culture and our practices. yeah, we've lost a lot of bush tucker and medicine. A lot of animals becoming extinct, you know, in our cultural stories and practices, you know, practicing, I guess, the men's business and women's business. So what we're looking at now, hopefully in the future, is adaptation. That's one of my biggest things, is to look at what bush tucker is missing or what we're losing now, and looking at some kind of adaptation planning for the future. You know, maybe mobs up the top of the hill might have the same kind of soil or landscape where we can grow bush tucker and that, and I guess creating some kind of partnership with them so that we can look after that. We are starting some projects out on the islands, looking at the threatened species. We're starting in November, working with philanthropists, and looking at how do we adapt the habitat, I guess, for the turtles to keep coming up on the islands. At the moment, we've got 80 coming up. We don't actually know how many have been coming up in the past, but I guess, you know, it's just a start anyway. Yeah, and I guess, yeah, St. Helens, Halliday Bay and Cape Hillsborough, you know, these are sites, especially the Shell Midden with the rock shelter. That's been backdated positive to 64,000 years, and, you know, slowly it's eroding, but, you know, it's up on a hill. It's in an open cove, so, you know, a lot of the weather, cyclonic and that weather events is actually, you know, destroying it. So we're looking at just ways of how to, you know, if we can't move sites or move things like that, what do we do? Yeah, and that's pretty much well it. Well, that's just some photos of us doing the assessments. Actually, the top left has actually out on my country, and it's actually on a national park. It's a track. They won't move the track, but after a storm surge and cyclone, when we went back, that track was washed out about 1.5 meters, and we found a big artifact site, 100 meters long. Yeah, so, you know, working on future planning with hopefully parks to maybe, I guess, protect the site. And also that third photo on the top, that's where a lot of the soil's been moved off the beach, probably about 10, 15 metres in from that same storm surge and cyclone. Yeah, so that's all. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Samala, for your presentation and for highlighting the importance of including the knowledge and perspectives of traditional owners and thinking about adapting our culturally significant habitats. So that now brings us to the end of our speakers. So thank you to all of our speakers for your presentations and for sharing your expertise with us today. I see we've got some questions trickling into the Q&A chat function. So just a reminder, please keep them coming in. We've got time now to move to our panel session and touch on some of those questions. Also another reminder that you can continue to update and like those critical questions that you're most interested in and would like to see answered live if possible. So let's move on into our panel session now, where we've got all the presenters that just talked to you ready to answer questions. So I think we'll start with this first question, and John, I think to begin with, it'll start with you, and then there's probably others in the panelists who can jump in and answer the second half of the question as well. So the question, John, is how do you think the expected increase in rainfall intensity might influence the likelihood of compound flood events? And then a follow-on question is, and what might this mean for our biodiversity and opportunities for nature-based solutions? So we'll start with you, John. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, this is a really tricky one to quantify with projections information. So I'm sure everyone's aware that flood and inundation is a combination of rainfall and other effects, and you can have coastal inundation in the absence of rain as well. So it's a matter of taking multiple things into consideration simultaneously. But at its most simple level, yes, it's a reasonable expectation that with increasing rainfall intensities, flood risk is likely to go up. And we're seeing that already. Shire engineers are looking to increase the carrying capacity of urban drainage for these very reasons. So it's definitely happening. And if we look at the observations historically, we've seen, you know, in the last few decades, really substantial increases in those rainfall amounts from, you know, somewhere between 5 and 20% or even higher in some instances. And I think there was a question relating to the design rainfalls as well that the Australian Rainfall and Runoff Handbook deals with. This is a thing that engineers use routinely. I think it's put out by Engineers Australia. The most recent revision of that handbook did address how to modify design rainfalls to take account of future rainfall changes, and those guidelines say to increase the intensities by 5% per degree of global warming. So that's a fairly conservative estimate, but there was quite a lot of effort went into trying to quantify that in more detail, and it was quite frankly too difficult a nut to crack at the time. But work on that's continuing, and I think the next revision of the handbook will have more information than that, or at least a bit more nuanced information at least.
Great, thanks, John. And would any of the panelists like to jump in on the second half of that question, which was around, you know, what will these flood events, what will they mean for our biodiversity and for opportunities to build our nature-based solutions, the coast and otherwise?
Can jump in.
Thanks, Becky.
Yes, I guess along the coast, more and more we are thinking about whether we can actually protect against erosion events and flood events using things like mangroves or shellfish reefs. I have to say there's been less work on their effectiveness against flooding compared to erosion, and that's probably a bit of a knowledge gap that needs to be addressed with that research.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, we'll move on to another question now. So it sort of does follow on, Becky, from just what you were talking about a little bit there. So the question is around that there's long-standing problems with this sort of hard coastal defences, in that they often increase sediment accumulation in some areas and exacerbate erosion in adjacent shorelines. So have you looked at this following this construction of your mussel shellfish reef that you talked about near Geelong?
Yes. So there's no evidence currently, but we're still processing the data. And so what we're doing to be able to answer that question is that we're doing drone surveys of the entire sediment compartment, and I think they're on either an annual or biannual rate, as well as doing drone surveys of just the area that should be affected by the reef. And we're also using historical imagery to get an idea of what would have happened in that sediment compartment over different temporal scales, like decadal and annual scales. And so we are collecting data to be able to answer that question and to ensure that the reef hasn't caused any unintended consequences in other areas of the shoreline.
Great, yeah, thanks, Becky. And Georgia, is there any perspective you can give on in terms of nature-based solutions in an urban area, and sort of looking at what other impacts they might have? Like they might cool our cities, but do they have alternative impacts that we're not, you know, we need to look into in terms of anything that exacerbates any other issues that are going on? Or is it just a positive story in terms of, you know, greening our urban spaces?
I think it's a pretty complex story, and I guess what I was trying to kind of emphasize is that there are opportunities if we start thinking about this really holistically that could be really good, but we will miss if we don't start thinking about them in that way really quickly. I think the fire example just shows exactly how complex this issue is in cities, and I'm certainly not a fire expert, and I would never purport to be that. I think one of the other things that's kind of complicating from an urban perspective is that, you know, and I guess this is the same in many other landscapes, but really the capacity for policy to dictate what happens in the private realm is quite limited. And so people can, you know, pretty much do whatever they want with their gardens as long as they don't cut down a tree that's a long way from their house in a non-fire area. So finding ways to link and strategically kind of plan for nature-based solutions in the public realm that complement what's going on in the private realm and vice versa, I think is a really important part of the story. And there's lots of programs around, I know, that are designed to deliver biodiversity benefits or human health and well-being benefits that may be on private land that maybe haven't started thinking about that kind of nature-based solution to cooling or other physical challenges that are facing cities. So it's a complex and kind of integrated space, and unfortunately I think there's no easy answers, but I think there's lots of opportunities if we're prepared to open our minds a little bit and think outside the square of what we can do with these things.
Right, yeah, fantastic. So we have a question coming for you, Samala. The question is there support through educational departments or other sources for the next generation to be involved in understanding weather patterns and be involved in looking after sacred sites? And more generally, what are some of the key steps that can be taken to support this intergenerational exchange?
No, at the moment, we haven't gotten that far. I guess the biggest issue and problems with us as 7 different tribes on the reference group is we all have different priorities. But that is certainly one thing that my mob has been working on. You know, but I find that a lot of the education department, this is just me personally, my thoughts, is that it's just based around NAIDOC. There's nothing else like that. I know in Queensland, a lot of the ranger programs, now they have junior ranger programs where the corporations or the Aboriginal groups, you know, start their junior ranger programs. And that's something that we need to do. In central Queensland here, it's been 15 years, we don't have a ranger group. You know, for the 15 years we've been trying to get funding and resources for it. And I guess, you know, my mob's been given the opportunity now to work with philanthropists that own some of the islands on our country, and, you know, we're doing that planning, and it is a big thing because when we do actually go to schools and do NAIDOC or do programs, we do the wetland weekend here at St. Lawrence every year. You know, we're able to work with a lot of the teachers and the principals in the schools, so that's something that we want to implement in the future. And I guess it's just the resources and if it fits into their curriculum too. I'm sorry, I forgot the second question, Sonia. I'm not sure if I answered it all.
I think it was. I mean, some of the second part of the question was around sort of intergenerational exchange of information.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do find that a lot of the mobs now in our area, especially the Whitsundays, they have what it's called the GBRF Reef Islands Initiative. So that's going to be focused more in the Whitsunday Islands. So that'll be something that they'll be looking for in the future. And, you know, just us others, TORG tribal members or representatives will be able to support them in that too.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'd like to talk to a few of the panelists around sort of community thoughts on a lot of the options for adapting or shifting species that you've been talking about today. So, for example, Nikki, you were talking about the colonisation, and you know, you're getting a sort of a feel for what the community's thoughts on that. Are they generally supportive? Do you find a bit of pushback to that sort of a option that you've identified?
To be honest, the community are not particularly involved in any of the decisions so far. We've been doing most of this trial really under the auspices of the threatened species, the recovery team for the species, and under the sort of regulations of the state government. So when I talk about this, so there is quite often, I get a lot of calls and reproaches from the public who volunteer their land. You know, a lot of people have got wetlands and are wondering whether it might be suitable for the species because they're quite keen to have a threatened species on their property. And there's a lot of community involvement in restoration and in some of the releases, but in terms of sort of the difficult decisions about relocating species, most of the work we've done so far is relocating them into land tenures that are government controlled, where we can do fox baiting and all those critical things. Because if we can't keep the predators out, we wouldn't be going ahead with these sorts of translocation trials.
Okay, great. And Becky, I know that you've been doing some community surveys around what the community thinks about your hybrid and natural-based coastal solutions you've been talking about. What's the feeling you get from the community?
Yeah, so I guess because coastal protection structures are really only there to protect us, community consultation has been a really important part of our work. And we get mixed results. From our surveys, we've had quite a lot of support for nature-based methods, and the community has as much trust in nature-based methods as they do in the more traditional ones like seawalls. But there is also other subsets of the community that, for example, don't like mangroves or think that the Shellfish reef is not as aesthetically pleasing as it could be. So yeah, the social perspective is really important when you're looking at kind of urban ecosystems or climate resilience, where we're trying to protect people but balance it against the environmental values as well.
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. So a quick question for Nikki and Samala. How can we do more to care for Australia's biodiversity and Indigenous heritage in the face of the changing climate that we're experiencing and the weather extremes that are predicted to come into the future? Who wants to start?
I can. I guess it's all about reaching out to the mobs. You know, it's really hard for us to know who's doing research and things out there, and I guess it's like including us. You know, like we're moving towards starting up some kind of databases and networks with researchers to, you know, just share that knowledge, work together, build each other's capacity. Yeah, I guess that's the biggest thing is, you know, seeking out each other. And, you know, there's plenty of organisations there, especially like CSIRO, Mandy Hopkins, Roe Hill and Cairns and that. So a lot of us mob know each other along the Queensland coast especially. Do even the Great Barrier Reef Foundation now, we've got our traditional owner technical working groups that we're doing. And, you know, if anybody needs to know what the traditional owners are, who the contacts are, you know, they can contact us. Someone will know, you know, just sort of that, yeah, working together, making that start, you know, and communicating and that, yeah.
Yeah, like you said in your presentation around the co-production and the partnerships between the people involved.
Yeah, and we're doing a lot of great work now, a lot of mobs already. Some aren't because they just don't have that the resources or know who to approach. Yeah, so I guess, you know, that's one of the big win-wins for both of us, looking after Great Barrier Reef, the catchments, water together, yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks. John, in your presentation, you talked about a number of different extremes. What, in your view, will be the key extremes that we need to consider in terms of impacts on our biodiversity into the future? You know, there's flooding, droughts, there's extreme heat waves, there's fire, there's such a diverse number of extremes. Do you have a sense of, you know, from your point of view, what we need, where we need more research so that we can have better information to inform biodiversity management?
Wow.
Yeah,
just an easy question. Oh, look, gee. There are some really big challenges scientifically. You know, understanding what's going to happen with groundwater. in drying climates. This is close to my heart. Spent a lot of years working on an endangered frog species, which is dependent on, very dependent on groundwater resources, and seeing those groundwater resources dry up and not really knowing how to anticipate or predict how that might go in the future, and just assuming then that everything's bad news. That's really challenging. Getting at those high intensity rainfall events is scientifically very challenging, as I kind of alluded to before. Getting climate projections information at the spatial scales that conservation ecologists need the information is also extremely challenging. Getting the models to be sophisticated enough to be able to accurately model microclimates at, you know, tens of meters scale. You know, I mentioned some projections at 5 kilometers. That's high resolution for climate models, but for ecosystem modeling, that's pretty coarse. That's another big challenge, and really will take a lot of computational grunt to be able to do that in a fully dynamical way, the way we do with climate. But yeah, gee, just depends what particular risks you're trying to gain an understanding of, I think.
I think that's right. I think that talks also to Samala's point about co-producing. You know, if we want to understand what biodiversity sector needs from the climate science community in terms of resolution, data and focus and prioritisation, then it's about working together with that community. And I think the Greater Glider project that you were talking about in your presentation, John, is a great example of how that can work, how we can work between the climate change and the biodiversity communities to draw together that information and work out what's needed and then provide it for a great response. So yeah, that's fantastic. All right, it seems like unfortunately we're already out of time. Somehow that went really, really quickly. I guess I'd just ask the panel just in 1 minute if they have any more thoughts on how more research can help us solve these challenges, how to prepare and strengthen our actions to support biodiversity and approaches. You know, John talked about some of the key things in terms of climate change research that he thinks we need to focus on. From the biodiversity or coastal protection, is there any key areas of research that the panelists think we need to focus on into the future a bit more?
I think for at least the coastal protection research, we're really only at the tip of understanding what are the good designs to use, how effective are they, upscaling them, so that there is lots of research left that we can do. But yeah, I think key is really understanding the kind of ecological engineering and social interaction that these structures that really are an interface between that. And so we need to focus on all three of those holistically to understand how they can work and how effective they are in all of those different aspects.
Sorry, Nikki, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about the earlier question about these extreme rainfall events. And I think one of the issues with our increasing bushfire frequency is that our soils are getting particularly hydrophobic, as in they don't retain the water. So the water's running off very rapidly and just exacerbating the drying of the soils. So I think perhaps looking at how restoration ecology and restoring certain types of species into ecosystems might help with soil permeability and biotubation. So there's some really lovely work, done by Leonie Valentine at UWA, looking at returning bandicoots into urban areas and how they not only reduce the fire risk by taking out leaf litter, but also, turn over the soil and make it more permeable to water. So I guess trying to understand, extreme events, soil changes in our soils thanks to higher burning rates, and how maybe biodiversity can contribute to improving water retention might be useful.
Absolutely. Fabulous. All right, we are slightly over time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you everyone for your great questions that have come through the Q&A function, and thank you to our presenters. I know that there were some questions we didn't get to address, but as mentioned previously, we will be sending around a resources pack that will address some of those key questions that we missed out on, as well as providing other links and also the slides. So, and there will of course be more opportunities to further discuss the links between climate change and biodiversity in the remaining 2 webinars in this webinar series. And we'll drop the link for the registration for those webinars in the chat box in just a minute. And a heads up that our next webinar will be on the 22nd of September. So please do join us for that. So on that note, I guess I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today and for our speakers. We have opened up the chat again now, so please do feel free to provide any final thoughts that you've got from the audience or comments in that chat function. And also just a quick note that as you log out of the webinar, you'll note that there's a feedback form which pops up for this event. We would love to hear your feedback and to see what other issues are of most importance to you. So do please take just that short moment to fill in the feedback form. Would be really appreciative. And on that note, we'll thank you again and say that we hope to see you at the next Climate Change, Fire and Biodiversity webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you.